Hey guys, my name's Nick and welcome back to the channel, and in this video we are continuing with the Plaguebearers of Nurgle and finishing off those final little bit of details, getting some basing work done, and then wrapping up the squad. So without any more introduction chat, let's get straight into the video. So here we go then. This is a reminder of where we were at before. So all the skin was pretty much complete, and we're going to now move on to some of those shrunken handbag heads that he's carrying. And to do this, a bit of a weird technique. So this is sort of shading parts of the model with Druchii Violet. So this is going to settle in all the recesses and cause a bit of contrast across the skin. So if you can imagine that these heads have been badly battered and bruised and obviously decapitated and ripped off of the victim that they've come from, they're going to be bruised and discoloured and everything else. So applying a couple of different shades to this before we dry brush over the top of it really gives that sort of bruised and damaged effect. So that's the whole point of this. So we're sort of pre-shading really with this purple. And yeah, just applying that. There's a couple of models within the unit that have these heads. Let me just think of the other unit while we think of it. Yeah, depending which banner you go for, there's a head on one of the banners as well. So make sure that you catch that guy when you're doing this bit of, if you're batch painting your Plague Bearers. So that's pretty much it. Just sort of applied randomly across bits of the head. Now we let that dry, but while we're letting that dry, we're going to highlight up some of the blood areas of all the guts that are spilling out of the guy. So just applying a bit of the lighter red here, which is bloody red in my case from Vallejo, but whatever paint equivalent that you have. So we're just applying that over the top of where we'd done the wash of Nuln oil over the gory red base that sits in there. So just pick out all those sort of scabby, sore areas that had that dark red and then the black wash, just to sort of brighten those areas up and make it look a bit more visceral. So yeah, just picking those bits out. There's a couple of bits that I'm going to be doing while other sections of the model are drying. You can see it's a little bit tricky trying to get the paintbrush in here while maintaining it on camera focus, but we just about make it there. And then we can move on to the next bit. That next bit is to start applying some rust to the plague swords that these guys carry. So I noticed Games Workshop have painted theirs black and then used sort of a fairly bluish highlight. I want these weapons to look a bit rusted, a bit diseased, a bit untreated, unkept, rather than sort of that clean line effect. So what I'm going to do is I've got some Vallejo dry rust effect, which I'm just going to dry brush on really. So and just in sort of random patterns across the bolt gun primed sword, or the plague dagger, whichever it's going to be called. I think it's a plague dagger. And just applying that sort of randomly across that blade. Any kind of rust effect would do. I guess even using like various different metal tones, like brass or anything like that, hammered copper. Just something to give a bit of tonal variation across the sword, make it look a little bit unkept and a little bit in theme really with the Nurgle blades. I don't want it looking all sort of pristine. I think the Games Workshop one does look a little bit too clean for my liking. But yeah, so we're just going with that rusty effect on this one. Now that rust is done, that also means that the Druchii Violet has dried on those heads, and we're going to now move into Drakenhof Nightshade. So this is a blue wash rather than a purple one. Again, this is just filling in all those gaps where we've done the rotten flesh colour, and just filling in around where those purple parts are and just filling that in with blue. Again, this is sort of emphasising the damaged and beaten up head effect, just to make it look all bruised, nasty and damaged. Just because they've been ripped off of an unsuspecting poor victim of Nurgle. So yeah, we're just going to speed through this bit. So I'll just put this on 4 times the speed, and you get the idea. Just remembering, make sure that you keep it nice and neat and not get it on any of the skin, and apply it to the other heads that you might have in your other builds of the unit. Whilst those shades are still drying, we can go on and go back to our red blood areas, and what I'm going to do is just cover these with a thin layer of gloss varnish. Now this just sort of brightens it up and makes it look a bit more shiny, a bit more bloody. So it's just a case of dabbing in a little bit of gloss varnish over those little areas. So yeah, fairly simple bit, just while everything else is drying, it's quite handy to keep things moving, and just finishing off other sections while other bits sort of begin to dry off, just to save you a bit of time. You can obviously just fast forward this video and just go back to the head section if you wanted, just depending on the order that you're painting. But I like to keep things moving and just keep other bits going whilst bits dry. So just multitasking. So that's the effect we're at so far then. We've still got a few little bits of detail to go. Not much more to go, to be honest, but that's how he's looking so far. And you can see now that he's not looking as green that some of the pictures I've had before are coming out. He does look a little bit more muted than pure green. But we're now going to move back to dead flesh, or the equivalent colour in Games Workshop. And this is a very, very, very light dry brush over the top of those heads. Really trying to pick out the raised areas. But as you do that, because it's a dry brush and going over some flat sections of the head, it begins to remove that blue and purple pre-shade that we'd already done. Just pushing that colour more into the recesses just to look a bit more bruised and battered. And then just brightening up those heads. Just to give them a bit more skin-like, but with the bruising looking like it's under the skin, if you kind of follow what I'm trying to achieve here. Making sure that we obviously do the back of those heads as well, just giving that a nice little light dry brush. And this is going to be 2 stages of dry brush, so we're just going to go with the dead flesh first, just to sort of remove most of the pre-shaded blue and purple effect. So once we've done that, we can then move on to the next stage of dry brush, which is bone white. So this is just a final light dry brush over the top of that, really just to pick out those top details. So exactly the same technique again, just using the bone white, and this will sort of automatically pick out the brows and the eye, the nose and the cheeks and the ears and so on. So just very light, just to sort of tidy up where that dead flesh was before that. So yes, this is just a final little bit of detail. You haven't really got to do this stage, to be honest, but just depending on how quickly you want to paint your hordes up. Obviously I'm taking a little bit more time than I probably would normally, but yeah, these are just that final little nice touch. So once we've done that, we can now move on to some brown, and this is what I'm going to use for the hair on those heads, as well as parts of the top horns. So we can move into sort of the bony horn section and the hair of those heads that are in his handbag. And you can also use exactly the same technique here across the entire army. I've painted all of the heads, all the horn heads across the entire unit, as well as the staff on the banner bearer as well. So at this same stage, when you've got the brown out, just make sure that you apply it to all the similar sections, just to save you on your paint. And what I've done is just skip through that, because it was quite tricky to try and paint that on camera, because it's quite close and quite fine work, to make sure I didn't spill the brown onto any of the sections already done. And as you can see, I've sort of feathered it and arrowed it in towards the top of the helmet. You can see those sort of splay marks there, trying to sort of give a rough blend at this stage of that brown into the top of the crown of the head. Now the second stage of those horns is to use a black, and this is starting at the tip and then working down towards the base, and again sort of splaying it out with those sort of arrowed finishes to give a bit of a rough blend, but kind of a bone effect. I'm not particularly great at this effect. I have done it on Magnus and so on. It was a lot easier with an airbrush, but very difficult again to try and paint that on camera. But I'm just going to speed through to here, and you can see the effect that I've gone for. So it's black at the top, and then you sort of arrow it and thin line it down into the brown, and that's pretty much it. And I've done that across the entire army. And unfortunately I couldn't catch that on camera. It was very difficult to do. I'm not particularly great at doing that effect, so trying to do it on camera with a very fine 000 brush was a bit tricky. So apologies that you didn't quite catch all that detail, but you can see the finalised effect. We're now going to move into Agrak's Earthshade, and that is going to wash all of that metal work on the sword, and it will also go over any of the brown sections as well, especially the hair or the staff that you've got on the banner bearer. Any areas that have got brown or that metal work, we're just going to give it a nice Agrak's Earthshade wash. What I'll do is I'll speed this bit of the video up, but you can still see the same effect. That brown just settles into the hair recesses quite nicely, and then just sort of mixes the tones of the rust and the metalwork on that sword. So yeah, that's the whole purpose of that. While everything else is now drying, we can now move on to some basing. And I've got some Vallejo ground texture base here, which comes in a massive tub, but is perfect for doing textured bases. Games Workshop do their own version of this. I think it's a little bit expensive for what it does, but I'm just using a really old battered brush just to push this textured compound around the base. Yeah, this is a really old brush. Don't use anything anything that you want to value, because this stuff does clog up the brush and you are sort of pushing it into the ferrule and everything else. It does ruin brushes. You can of course use Games Workshop special textured base tool thing that they have, which has got that thin and flat end so that you can scoop it out of the pot and then spread it around the base. And that's, I'm just using an old brush because I don't have that particular implement. Once again, what I'll do is I'll just speed through this last bit as I push and poke that textured basing material around the base of the model just to finish that area off. And that's pretty much it for the basing, the first stage of basing. And once that's dry, that's or vaguely dry, that's the effect that we're looking for. As you can see there, we go around just to catch up on all the detail we've got so far. So those horns are sort of mostly done. I have actually applied a small bit of bone white into that horn section just to help it blend onto the rotted flesh top coat as well. It just helps a little bit of that blend. Obviously I couldn't catch that on camera either, it's very fine painting, but it just helps with the transition between the brown and the base skin colour of the model. So the next bit then is just to give a light dry brush of a silver, I think this is Vallejo's chainmail silver, this one, but any sort of mid silver will do. I'm just applying that just so that it picks up the raised areas and the sides of the blade, because it's quite spiky. The other blades in the rest of the unit aren't as spiky as this guy, but they do have that serrated plague sword edge, and it's the same thing. So we'll just drag the dry brush across just to pick up those raised areas. Just a standard dry brush. I think everyone's fairly familiar with dry brushing these days. But there's no reason to sort of do any kind of other technique at this stage, just on these sort of plague swords. So that's exactly what I'm doing, just making sure I catch all of those final raised areas. The next stage we can do then is paint over that now dried textured base. I think I've left that probably a good couple of hours to actually dry. Depending how thickly you apply it will depend how slowly it dries, obviously. And then we're just going to go over this with charred brown. So this is sort of a very dark earthy brown. And this is basically the first coat of paint over that dried on textured base paint, and yeah, just sort of begins to sort of complete the model, I guess. It's the bit we're going to dry brush over the top of it, but just to get rid of that white colour, that grey colour from that actual textured paint, and it just gets rid of that effect and puts in sort of the right colour palette with the rest of my Nurgle demons and my Nurgle marines. They're all going to have this similar kind of basing. So this is all I'm doing is just painting that painting over that textured paint with charred brown. As before, we'll just speed through this final little bit as I carefully apply that brown around all the feet and all the toes that are sticking out. Obviously that's just got to be really careful you don't get that brown onto any of the painted model already. Now what I've done here is I've switched to a different model within the unit, those super observant people. Just because that charred brown was taking forever to dry. And as you can see, I've also painted in the eyes. And what I've done for this is just a small dot of gold yellow. Again, I couldn't do this on camera. It's far too difficult to keep on camera and get that yellow dot in the right place. And then with that yellow dot, all I've done is shade it with Cassandora yellow. And that is all I've done with the eyes. I've done that across the entire unit. So we can now switch back. This model's base is dry. I've gone around the edge with a bit of earth colour as well, but we'll come back to that in a minute. And all we're going to do is dry brush over that charred brown with khaki, or whichever equivalent you've got. It's basically a lighter, almost bone white, but not quite brown. And it's just going to start picking up all the textured detail from that textured paint. So just a light dry brush over the top, just to finish off the painted part of the base. Now the textured paint doesn't raise too much. It's not crazy amounts of raised detail on it. So just be careful, make sure that you keep the dry brush nice and light so that the darker brown still shows through. Now to the fun part. Now you see I've changed model again because that other colour was still drying on my other painted model. Now this is the secret sauce for my basing. This is a little bit unusual. You might squirm a little bit. But I am an owner of a hedgehog. I can hear you laughing in the background. And this is some of his food. Just to prove the point, hang on a second, I shall cut you into a video as he's just come out of hibernation a couple of days ago. So as you can see, this was recorded on the 11th of Feb 2018. He's just come out of hibernation only a couple of days ago. And this is Gizmo. This is our three-legged hedgehog. He's a rescue hedgehog. And we've kind of adopted him and he now lives in our garden. So it's a little bit weird to be putting this in the video, but just to prove the point that I didn't go out and buy a load of mealworms and slug pellets or whatever just for the basing. But no animals were harmed in the stealing of his food in order to complete this basing, I promise you. This is Gizmo and this is Gizcam. So let's go back to his food then and see what we're going to do with the basing. So hedgehog food is basically sort of mealworms and little dead bugs and so on. It's sort of a top up to their regular food really. So, but perfect I think for Nurgle basing. And all I'm going to do is super glue a few bits of his food randomly across the base. Mainly focusing on the mealworms and the little bugs rather than all the other bits and pieces that go in it. And just get a pair of tweezers and stick those onto the base. Now most pet shops will supply this to you obviously, or you can buy it online. I think even Amazon sell this kind of stuff these days. And you can either overpaint them after you've applied them to the base, or you can leave them au naturel, which is what I'm going to do. And all I'm going to do to finish them off, as you can see, one of these little weird little dead bug things. They don't smell, honest, and then you can just sort of super glue other bits and pieces on it, and that's pretty much going to finish the base off. All I'm going to do is actually apply some gloss varnish to these, just to give them a bit more slimy feel, like they're worms climbing out of the floor, or you know, falling out of the Plaguebearers, or anything to do with Papa Nurgle himself. He likes a little bit of worms and slime, right? So that's what I'm doing to the base. And I'm just going to, you know, put a few little dollops of other bits and pieces on his base just to sort of fill it out a little bit more. And then apply that exactly the same in various different patterns across the rest of the unit. And once we think we've got enough on, just leave it to dry really. Just standard super glue drying time, about half an hour or so. And then while that's drying, we can just touch in the sides of the rim of the base. So I've used here Vallejo's earth colour, but whatever you're going to tie into the rest of your army will suffice. So I've already done one coat or two coats of this already, but where all the dry brushing and everything else sort of has spilled over the edges, it's nice just to tidy it up with a final little coat just to get rid of those overspills onto the rim of the base. And that's pretty much where we're going to wrap the video up. I didn't actually record the gloss varnish part, but you can see in some photos of the unit exactly what the finished effect is. So there we go then guys, that's going to wrap this video up. We have our first unit of 20 Plaguebearers complete. That's a total of 155 measly points of pure cannon fodder. I am going to be adding a new unit to this to give them a bit of a bolster, and that unit is the Spoilpox Scrivener. So he gives a bit of a buff to Plaguebearers of Nurgle, so I'm going to be painting him up in a very similar style. And that will be in a forthcoming video, obviously. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something new. I hope you can apply those techniques to your own models. They work on sort of the Plaguebearers that are riding the Rotflyers and other bits and pieces as well. So yeah, you should be able to get a good bit of chunk of your army done using this fairly simple technique. I think it's quite effective. I hope you do too. If you did, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. And I shall catch you guys on the next video.